Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. A deadly earthquake jolted parts of Pakistan on Monday late afternoon. With a 5.8 magnitude, the earthquake has claimed more than 25 lives and has injured over 400 people. Now, while there is a long way to go in terms of being able to predict earthquakes and take preemptive measures accordingly, understanding which areas are most vulnerable to these disasters and what can be done to minimize the impact is an important guide for communities. On today's show, we take a closer look at how this can be done. Joining us for this discussion today is retired Major General Saeed Aleem, former chairman of Pakistan's National Disaster Management Authority. Joining us from Rawalpindi, we're also joined by Mr. Denis McClean, spokesperson for the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, joining us from Geneva. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Major General Aleem, I'd like to begin with you. Now, when we're talking about the earthquake that took place yesterday in Pakistan and the fact that you have extensive experience with the National Disaster Management Authority, during these times, which areas are most vulnerable?
Meshal, essentially, the vulnerability of people in these areas is as a result of faulty development, poor construction, which is very often not compliant with the disaster risk reduction guidelines. Sometimes the state side's development is also not adequately compliant. And since the structures are not compliant with the envisaged hazard, so therefore they are the ones which create more problems.
Right.
When you see, say, unsafe structures or houses collapsing in this particular example where we've seen an embankment of the canal caving in at a number of places. So there certainly is deficiency in the construction standards of that canal bank.
And Mr. Aleem, you mentioned here specifically the guidelines and the buildings that don't abide by those guidelines. Could you take us through what those guidelines really mean and what points are essential to remember during those?
Construction or development instructions have to be formulated in the light of the potential hazards that they can be subjected to. And I think we learned a lot from our experiences in the recent past, especially the 2005 Kashmir earthquake and the number of smaller ones which followed thereafter. So we did design a very comprehensive building code through Pakistan Engineering Council and the whole process of consultation of concerned stakeholders. Now, those instructions have been compiled in the form of, the guidelines, which have been promulgated also from the government, federal government. Then, obviously, those implementation measures have to be at multiple tiers. There are some public sector development programs. The concerned departments have to fulfill those requirements, not only in design process, but subsequently when those structures are being constructed. So they have to be rigorously enforced and monitored. Simultaneously, the building control authorities in those respective regions and districts and municipal authorities in areas like Mirpur, where the recent earthquake has affected, they have to actually be up to date to enforce those building codes.
Mr. McClean, now when we're talking about disaster management and what preemptive measures can be taken, take us through what are the key areas for investment here.
Well, I think the first thing is that we have to prioritize which buildings need to be absolutely earthquake proof. And I would cite particularly schools and hospitals, health facilities, locations where you're likely to have large numbers of people gathering at any particular time of the day. These are particularly vulnerable. We saw that very strongly in Nepal, where the death toll was considerably less in the 2015 earthquake, simply because of a stroke of luck that it was the one day of the week when children were not at school, so no school children died. But if those kids had been in those schools which collapsed during that earthquake, thousands of those kids would have died. And we've seen tragically that happen in many major earthquakes over the last 20 years. You know, huge numbers of children and hospital patients have lost their lives because they were in structures that were not fit for purpose. So I would say that the lesson from these events is, you know, prioritize schools, hospitals, workplaces where there are large numbers of people, and ensure that the safety of those structures is adequate to the threat of an earthquake of this magnitude. And similarly, you know, to ensure that the population knows how to act in the event of an earthquake happening, because we all know that the aftershocks can be just as dangerous in the following 48 hours or longer periods of time, and it's not safe for people to go back into buildings, no matter how much they want to retrieve their possessions or whatever it might be. You know, that it's very important that the public's awareness of disaster risk is raised to a higher level than it is at the present, I would say.
Now, Mr. McClean, that is an essential point that you've emphasized on, awareness. Now, when we're talking about awareness and what needs to be done in times of an earthquake, take us through the important steps that individuals need to keep in mind.
Well, at a very simple level, if you look at the case of school children, they should all be aware of the simple procedure they should enact if in the case of feeling an earthquake, because that's the warning that most of us get, is just when we simply feel the ground moving. They should immediately duck and hide under their desks until those few seconds are over and it's safe to leave the building in which they find themselves. You know, simple things like that. The worst thing anyone could do is to panic in these situations. And if you are living in an earthquake-prone area, then you should identify where it is safe to be if in the building that you find yourself in, whether it's under a doorway or whatever it might be, to protect yourself from a serious injury, because we know that the injuries that ensue from earthquakes are life-threatening and can mean living with a disability for the rest of your life.
Now, Major General Aleem, when we're talking about what happens and what needs to be done during the disaster, what happens afterwards is just as important. What do you think needs to be done at all different levels of society, all different stakeholders? What do they need to do in order to provide relief to those who are impacted?
As my colleague pointed out, immediately after an earthquake strikes, rescue is the most important aspect which needs to be attended to. Because that is where there could be potential, fatal casualties which you could probably save through timely rescue. People who may have been buried under the debris of collapsed structures. So rescue obviously takes precedence. Concurrently, those who've been rescued are those who've been affected unharmed physically, but they also need to be taken care of. So relief actually then concurrently actually sets in. They need to be taken care of. They need to be attended, provided medical care where it is needed. They need to be cared for, fed, housed maybe when obviously if they've lost their shelters, and arranging that those who may have gone missing in the process, they need to be reunited with their families, and so that the family unit is reunited, and then thereafter, of course, the process of recovery sets in.
And in this process of recovery, how important is it for financial support to be given by various stakeholders of society?
Especially when the affectees may not have sufficient insurance cover, like typically in our society, in the rural communities, where there is hardly any awareness on that aspect. So anyone who's lost a shelter is virtually on the street, so they need to be helped. The state obviously puts in its effort to try and mitigate their circumstances by providing them initially some temporary shelter in terms of maybe either providing them tents or shifting them to some other structures which are still intact and vacant. But then thereafter, when the process of reconstruction starts, then they certainly need help, financial assistance. And that is also then an opportunity to ensure that the rebuilt structures would be compliant with the potential hazards that they are likely to be subjected.
On that note, thank you so much, Major General Saeed Aleem, for joining us and talking to us from Rawalpindi. And thank you, Denis McClean, for joining us and talking to us from Geneva. On that note, we're going to take a short break. When we return, we take a closer look at how communities can plan to cope better with the increasing number of natural disasters striking places all around the world. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. Now, with changing weather patterns, natural disasters are becoming more frequent all around the world. And no person or community is immune when a disaster does strike. But one way to cope with these disasters is by making a society more disaster resilient. On today's show, we take a closer look at what this means and what innovative ways can be used to protect communities. Joining us for this discussion is Professor Jason Pomeroy, an award-winning architect who focuses on sustainable cities. Joining us from Singapore, we're also joined by Mr. Charlie Baker, a specialist in sustainable architecture and urban design, focusing on climate change mitigation. Joining us from Manchester. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Professor Pomeroy, I'd like to know with you. Now, while we're talking about the environment becoming more and more unpredictable, how important is it for development in terms of how cities are planned to become more disaster resilient?
It's incredibly important because what we're finding is that if you think about the megacities of the world, the 35 megacities of the world, they're all in flood risk locations with over 10 million people. These are economic centers of trade and commerce, and yet they are constantly at threat of being flooded. And when you think about the coastal conditions being such, where rising sea levels are effectively going to be having a huge impact on the financial stability of these city centres, it is key that we're designing cities in a more resilient fashion. One only needs to think of Higashi Matsushima in Japan, which was ravaged by the tidal wave, the tsunami, back in March 2011, to the point that it needed to kind of reinvigorate itself as a new eco-city that can actually be resilient against any further threat in the future of another tsunami. So I think we need to start designing our cities in such a fashion that they become far more proactive and reacting against the rising sea levels. Gone are the days that we can simply create barriers to the water. Why don't we start thinking about how we can actually rise with the water and create something that is far more dynamic?
Right. On that point, I want to move to Mr. Baker, to him about this point. Mr. Baker, Professor Pomeroy mentioned how to make cities more proactive. In this regard, what do you think are the key aspects that city planners and government officials need to invest in order to make these cities more proactive?
Well, so I don't end up repeating what the professor said. I think one of the crucial things is the hinterland that feeds into our cities. So I've been looking at work in the Greater Manchester Combined Authorities area around what more trees can be planted, not only so that we improve the flood resilience of the immediate area, but so that we also reduce the amount of water that goes downstream and ends up obviously flooding people further downstream. The other issue as well, of course, is that trees are one of the most efficient, well-tested carbon sinks that we've got. If we then, once we've then got those trees growing, and I realise it'll be unlikely to be in my lifetime, but Jason looks a little more sprightly than I, maybe you'll be able to harvest those trees and build things with them. And I notice your pieces on camera show people using quite a lot of more natural materials. Concrete, though, is one of the things that we really ought to be being quite more proactive about not using. And if that's not, if that looks like that's mud building, that's good stuff. So you see what I mean? I think we can look at different building materials in our cities. The assumption has been that they need to be big, shiny glass boxes made out of very large quantities of steel and concrete with massive carbon footprints. They often overheat, or they need very, very expensive, very carbon intensive, unless your energy is all renewable, energy to run them. And so there's a whole load of things that you can do downstream from that.
Right. And Mr. Baker, while we're talking about how to make cities more resilient, of course, you work on this, how buildings and how infrastructure can help in climate change mitigation. Now, it's a circular process. If we're trying to preempt something, we're probably going to invest in how to make it resilient. But in order to change this entire system and make our cities more sustainable, what path do we need to be moving towards?
Well, I suspect the situation in Manchester is slightly different to Lahore. What we need to be doing in Manchester, and in fact most of England and Scotland and Wales, is massively reducing the amount of energy that our buildings need, so that the energy that we then have left as a country that we need to run on can be provided from renewable sources. Our current energy footprint as a nation is way bigger than the capacity of the country to fuel itself renewably. So in this country, we're looking at massively reducing the heat demand. I suspect that in Lahore, you want to probably be massively reducing the cooling demand. It creates a different kind of architecture, but one which has been practiced over the centuries in ways of passive cooling, using higher thermal mass where you can, the way you group your buildings to reduce solar gain, and reducing, I guess, the imitation of some of the early modernist buildings that, as I said earlier, have got way too much glass in them for our future.
Right. Professor Pomeroy, now this is that many people will ask, is that these cities that are old and that have already been developed, that are already working the way that they are working, how can we make them more resilient?
Well, I would like to pick up on that point that Mr. Baker just made. I completely agree with him in that we need to be ensuring that greenery can be used as a means of reducing temperatures, absorbing excess rainwater. They're wonderful sponges to noxious pollutants. And if you think about 1 square meter of rooftop garden can actually hold 6 liters of water. It is a remarkable attenuator. So if we were to think about Barcelona as a great city that has stood the test of time from its sort of Gothic era, barrio, through to the 19th century quarters of Eixample, which was planned out by engineer architect Cerdà, to what then became a catastrophic nightmare of traffic in the 20th century. They are now going through the incremental steps of taking cars off the street and creating super blocks that are effectively pedestrianising particular zones. And in this effect, they've been able to reduce the quantum of traffic on the roads by about 50%, as well as reducing the road infrastructure by 50%, but effectively reinstated public spaces, squares and arteries for people to interact with more greenery. And that greenery that's been injected into the centre has a huge benefit for people and also a huge benefit for the environment. So as an example of an aged city that has stood the test of time but is able to adapt for the 21st century as a wonderful city that is a smart city today, I think it's a great lesson to be learned from.
Right. On that note, I'd also like to introduce another guest joined us, Mr. Abdul Latif, who's a disaster management specialist joining us from Bangladesh. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Latif. Now, we've been focusing on infrastructure and how cities need to be planned to become more disaster resilient. But what are some of the other areas that need to also be focused on?
I think that structure is the one thing. The major important issue is really looking the hazard mapping of the urban areas. All the urban areas are not really vulnerable to the same hazards. And so the hazard mapping is one of the important things. What now we are doing in the urban areas in Bangladesh, we are doing the urban planning, and this is specifically to the specific urban areas with the hazard mapping with the community participation. So the community also can understand that what can be done and what should we do. And that is the major important, what I should say, the hazard mapping and accordingly do the urban planning.
Right. And you mentioned here community participation in order to create greater awareness. How are you doing that in Bangladesh's case?
Okay, I can give you the two examples. One of the city which was Mymensingh, and the other city where is the Rajshahi. So here we have the scientists, we have the geologists, we have the disaster management specialists, and then we have the municipal government, the city corporation governments, the organization. So we first have all the scientific information, as well as we do some type of the risk mapping in the hazard areas. If you know that the UN, when the UN started the work, make the city safer, and there are a number of the risk mapping scenarios or the tools that they are using. Some of those maps we are using, and we are also using, a number of the other maps. And then we had a discussion in a small group of the community. It takes a bit more time of cover the whole community. Then that concile and that make a bigger plan with a bigger audience and with all the local government. I say that the municipality or the city corporation, and then this mapping take into the plan that what should we do, whether it is the structural, the building, whether if it is a question of the water logging, whether we should think about the drainage. Whether we should think about the road, So all this planning has been done, and then the concerned department actively involved, and then this plan transfer into the action by the different departments.
Right.
And then the municipal government are really monitoring those things.
Right. On that point, Mr. Baker, now while we're talking about certain entities being more vulnerable than others, doing all of this, moving towards a sustainable society requires risks, also requires a lot of costs. Now, in all of this, how can those vulnerable communities participate, and how can they protect themselves?
Well, I think it probably depends on what we mean by an at-risk community. Certainly, it upsets me greatly on an almost daily basis that it is my country with a per capita carbon footprint 10 to 15 times the carbon footprint of your average Pakistani citizen, that we are therefore effectively the ones causing the problem. And yet I think it is the melting of the glaciers north of you that is causing your floods. I believe you've had some very bad ones in the last couple of decades. And so I think some of that preparation is very difficult. I mean, I think my people in this country have an obligation, all people in the West, in the high consuming countries, have an obligation to prepare on behalf of all of those who will suffer a great injustice if we don't mitigate our emissions, reduce our emissions, do everything we can. So then when you get onto cost, again, it depends on who bears the cost. Certainly in the work I do in Britain, the work is around how to minimize, how to level the cost between a householder having work done to the house or a building owner and the amount of money they'll save on their bills and their ability to participate in delivering renewable energy. I know we can make that cost level over time. I think it is a much greater problem, as your previous guest suggested, about how you prepare the global underprivileged of for what may well be coming. I think the forecasts I've seen from the IPCC around the reduction in the glacial cover in the Himalayas means that not only will Pakistan and India suffer from much greater flood events, but will suffer huge drought in between times. The monsoon appears to be no longer as reliable. The preparations for those therefore go in two levels. I think the disaster planning was interesting, and we had a dam in this country, a tiny one compared to some of your large hydro ones, that looked like it was about to burst last month. And our mapping agencies produced a map showing how much of Manchester would be flooded had that dam burst. And it was a surprising quantity of the city. So I think that preparation and that cost is, you've got to marry the future cost with the current cost. And I think at the moment, too few people, because the horizons are so long, too few people are looking at that long-term cost. So I've looked at a cost of £750 billion to get this country's housing stock to zero net carbon. That feels like a vast amount of money, but compared to the devastation that is heading our way if we don't, it feels like a relatively minor cost.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Charlie Baker, for taking out the time and talking to us. Now, Professor Pomeroy, as Mr. Baker highlighted the costs and what the damage will be done. Now, you've worked extensively in Southeast Asia as well. In terms of development and trying to invest in key areas, where do you think Southeast Asia specifically is going wrong?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, I would say that historically it has always been a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. When the various cities react, it's often all too late because the disaster has happened. Again, going back to Higashi Matsushima and the Fukushima nuclear reactor meltdown, which was the cause from the tidal wave tsunami that came in on March 2011, that kind of started the ball rolling in terms of energy deregulation and a great move towards disaster resilience, which led to a specially planned disaster resilience eco-town within Higashi Matsushima. But you often have to get shocked into a position in order to kind of make these moves. But I think that increasingly, as the tide, pardon the pun, of legislation is such now that the IPCC reports have clearly demonstrated that we are the cause, the sole cause of the cataclysmic effects of climate change because of industrialization, right, that governments are now investing solid money into fighting climate change and the effects of. So when I kind of look at what Singapore is doing, when I look at what Philippines is doing, when I look at what Japan is doing, there are policies in place that are clearly advocating for more dynamic city developments that are positively reacting towards rising sea levels. Right. There is conscientiousness to the fact that temperatures are rising and therefore the ability to green up the cities will help reduce and mitigate the effects of these increasing temperatures.
So Professor Pomeroy, over here, sorry to interrupt, but it seems like you're painting a more optimistic picture, which is good, that countries are becoming more proactive to what is happening. They're understanding that climate change will have vast implications, and therefore they're trying to move towards greener policies. On that note, I'd also like to introduce Dr. Gina Reinhardt, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Government at the University of Essex, joining us from Essex, UK. Thank you so much, Dr. Gina, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, you focus specifically on policymakers and the decisions that are made following and during a disaster. What are some of the key things that policymakers need to keep in mind in order not to just protect the city at large, but especially the most vulnerable?
Really, what policymakers have to do that we're really concerned about is prepare and try to help communities prepare to mitigate critical events before they happen. if they're successful at that, then disasters are not nearly as damaging or as severe. And we really believe that the disaster itself is the effect of an event on humanity, and that in some cases, an earthquake, just like Pakistan experienced today, could result in no deaths. It could result in very little damage if people were prepared for these sorts of things. If we had the appropriate architecture and engineering, if we had policies and regulations that were followed, and if we had people, early warning systems and ways for people to help each other.
Right. On that point of early warning signs, I want to go back to Mr. Latif and ask him how essential these are and what needs to be done to strengthen that system.
Well, I think that the early warning is a very important issue, and it should be the community-based early warning. And it should be very specific. Now, if you say that the urban areas, we're expecting more rainfall, what does that mean? You have to certainly say that this area or this town will have more rainfall, which now with the support from the World Bank, with the support from JICA and the European, our meteorological department are working on that. Now, dissemination is a very important issue. We started one of the dissemination through the volunteers in the coastal part, which is the cyclone preparedness program. And this cyclone preparedness program has very easy community-based warning system. They raise 3 flags. One red flag is for the preparation. Second red flag is time to be evacuate, and third red flag, evacuate. So that is the one. They also use the siren. We use the, most of the mosque had the microphone, and we use these mics as dissemination. And finally, in Bangladesh, we have a toll-free mobile phone number. So from any mobile company, you can call to that number and you can get updated weather forecast every time free of cost.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Latif, for joining us from Bangladesh. Dr. Gina, going back to you and talking a little more about what happens in the aftermath of a disaster. Now, according to an internal displacement monitoring center, a record number of 7 million people in 2019 from January to June have been displaced due to natural disasters. This is seen to go up to 22 million by the end of this year. Now, in the aftermath of all of this, displacement, of course, puts immense burden not only on the state, but the society at large. What can be done? What measures can be taken to ease this burden and also help those that are displaced?
That's a really great question. I think that what we have to do is look at a variety of dimensions for the groups of displaced people. So in some cases, displaced people can be absorbed into the community near where their displacement took place. So they can stay in their own country, and the other people in that country have the facilities or the means to help them. In order to prepare for that sort of thing, or really for any sort of displacement, we turn to the ideas of infrastructure and plans, because we have to be able to get people to where they need to be. And one of the biggest problems in some countries when disaster strikes is actually getting the people who survive out of the disaster area and bringing them to a safer place. So that sort of preparation of evacuation measures and evacuation guidelines, educating and informing the public about what they need to do is also really critically important. And we can't deny or ignore the great health implications, or particularly mental health implications, with some people who've lived in a place and their families lived in a place for generations. And the last thing that they see themselves doing is leaving that place and going somewhere else, possibly for a full generation, possibly forever, possibly never returning to the place where they believe their entire history belongs. So we need to be aware of the cultural and sensitive implications that the survivors are facing and really work for rehabilitation with them, which is not a way we think about dealing with survivors and displaced peoples, but the rehabilitation of the trauma they've been through and the trauma they're facing and the shocks they're going through is really critical to getting people to buy into their own replacement.
Right. And that's a very essential point you're making. But in all this, I do also want to talk more about what needs to be done on the international front in terms of collaborative efforts while dealing with these weather-related disasters. I mean, they're being caused by climate change, and we know it's a global phenomenon. Many countries, the most powerful and developed nations, are contributing towards this phenomenon, but the costs aren't being shared. In terms of disaster relief, what do you think needs to change on an international front?
Well, I think it's a very interesting way that you put it. The costs are actually monetarily landing on the disaster relief agencies, which are funded in large part by the developed world. However, the human costs are being borne almost entirely by developing countries who are not actually reaping any of the benefits of the industry that is leading to the climate change. So one of the things that is really necessary is for the international community to understand not just, oh, there are people who are in need and let's give some money, but beyond the charity of it, the idea that we are a global community and that this community is causing a lot of its own problems, and that people who are causing those problems need to be responsible and feel a responsibility for ameliorating the damage that is caused. We have a lot of really successful international efforts. Some of the early warning systems that are here now are all here because of the actions that took place after the tsunami in the Indian Ocean in 2004. And many of the community-sourced resources online, such as community mapping and people getting in touch with their families and people making it clear where there's road damage, where there's flooding, where you should and should not go. These are all as a result of international efforts as well, and are now spanning the entire Southeast Asian region and in some cases the whole world. So what we seem to lack is a coordination or an acceptance of the fact that if we spent more money now, we would not have to spend as much later.
Right. And Dr. Gina, on that point, I want to just come to Professor Pomeroy for a last question there. Professor Pomeroy, we're talking about disaster management in terms of what can be done internationally. What future do you see for regional and international cooperation when we're talking about sustainable development for each and every country, building of green cities? Do you see that as a possibility that the international community will come together and invest for a better future?
I do, but I actually think that it's something that is actually scalable. It's not just about happening at an international level or a local level. I would like to look at it as 4 spheres of influence, actually. Basically, if you have civil society, state, academia, and private corporation working collectively together, I think that's where you can get some real value. It was interesting, the previous speaker was mentioning about the community and the sharing of the ideas and the sharing of an understanding of what is happening post-disaster and those informal networks that are created out of these cataclysmic effects. Now, if you think about civil society being bonded together, and if you think about academia applying their research in terms of greater disaster resilience measures as well as early warning mechanisms, if you think about private corporations helping to continually fund these research activities, and it's supported at a state level to ensure that these measures are legislated and then through a global network can be kind of applied to these mega cities that are so
On that note, Professor Pomeroy, that essential point that you're making, that all stakeholders in society, whether it's those who are responsible for private capital, those who are on the legislative end, they all need to come together in order to create practical solutions to the problems we are seeing today. Thank you so much, Professor Jason Pomeroy, for joining us from Singapore. Thank you, Dr. Gina Reinhardt, for joining us from Essex. We have run out of time for today's show, but thank you so much for watching. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye.